My background is that I spent 20 years in the international oilfield services industry, and starting in 1979 and leaving eventually in 1998. And the reason that I'm doing what I do today is very much related to my time in the oil industry, because in my early days I was absolutely apolitical. I really didn't give a monkey's cuss about the global political situation, and in fact I used to basically make it very clear to the people who worked in the company or wanted to work for the company that they couldn't work for the company if they had any concerns about what was going on in the political arena. I mean, was it really our problem that Iran and Iraq were bombing 7 barrels of hell out of each other around the Shatt al-Arab waterway between 1982 and 88? No, our job was to work with whoever the client was to help them extract their hydrocarbons. But that pretty crass approach was rocked in 1991 when I was one of the first civilians to go into Kuwait at the end of the end of hostilities, the first Gulf War. And at the time I was working in the Middle East and based in Dubai, with a responsibility that covered the Middle East, everything from Egypt right up to Iran. And obviously Kuwait's right in the middle. And we had the heads up around about October of 1990 that we might want to think about what resources we would need to address a major firefighting situation. And when I asked the question as to what that was all about, I was told, well, intelligence is that Saddam will potentially ignite all of the Kuwait oil wells, setting off a massive conflagration. Now, at the time, we actually had one person in our company who had the expertise to support the firefighting crews, because that was all we really needed. Because there were blowouts around the world, but they weren't that regular, and so we had one guy, and he was training somebody up, but we had one guy, a guy called Wayne Sledge, who was our expert, if you like, on supporting firefighting crews. And we were told that we were obviously going to need more than one person, so we needed to start thinking about training to bring a number of other people up to speed. Well, nothing could have prepared us, of course, for what did occur. And of course, the history books, at the moment anyway, the history books tell us that the US forces, supported by the coalition of the willing, as it was known, effectively moved into Kuwait, started the attacks, the air attacks in January of 91, started the ground assault, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks later, and then it was a very swift operation, pushing the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait city, and in fact they were massacred on the highway of death, as it became known, the road between Kuwait city and Basra, which is a war crime of the highest order. But anyway, the wells were supposedly set alight by the retreating Kuwaiti forces, and I think it was something in the region of about 630 oil wells were blown. Not all were set alight; some were just pumping oil into the atmosphere. Anyway, when I landed in Kuwait city, flying over Kuwait was something incredible. It was literally like you might envision Dante's Inferno. And when we actually got on the ground, it was like being in Dante's Inferno. I mean, nothing could prepare you for what we were walking into. And the heat from the fires was having such a phenomenal effect on the local atmosphere that it was causing winds to gust from side to side. It was horrendous. Anyway, it became apparent that this was going to be pretty significant, and we wanted, the guys that I was traveling with, we wanted to see the extent of the what we were dealing with. So we had a US military driver who was driving us around, and we were taking stock of the situation. And as we got into the more southern areas, the areas down towards the border with Saudi Arabia, where it's very flat, and it's not sort of like people imagine a desert. It's just very flat, and it's more stone than sand. And as we got out to take a look at the situation, I could see that there were bodies in the foxholes that were dug as defensive positions around the wells. And I walked over to the foxholes, and basically what I saw there rocked my world, because what I saw was the young Iraqi conscripts, and they'd basically been assassinated. They still had the bullet holes in the backs of their necks. Obviously the cleanup teams hadn't come through yet to remove them. Anyway, it became very obvious to me that what I was witnessing did not support the official story, because it didn't look at all like the Iraqis had set the wells alight. And I made this observation to our driver, who looked rather embarrassed, but didn't say very much. And in the drive back, I was sort of, And a couple of days later, I was sitting in the mess having dinner at the headquarters of the Kuwaiti oil company in Akamadi, and I was approached by a US. Well, I say US, it's very interesting. He's definitely from the US, but he was wearing battle fatigues with absolutely no markings on whatsoever, no insignia, no rank. But he clearly knew who I was, and he walked over to me and looked down on me, and I remember his words very clearly. He said, "Urian Crane," and I didn't answer, but he just said, "I've been hearing you've been casting some aspersion about who set them wells alight." And I still didn't respond. And then he said, "Boy," he said, "that's the kind of thinking that can get you into a whole lot of trouble, and you best be keeping your mouth shut." And I was pretty rocked at the time. And anyway, he turned, walked away, and then he leaned over his shoulder and he said, "What the fuck's the matter, Ian? Aren't we paying you enough?" And although I'm telling the story in a fairly light-hearted manner right now, 21 and a half years after the event, at the time it was pretty scary. And I must confess that I didn't sleep properly until I got back to Dubai. And this was at 34 years of age, as I was then. This was the first time in my life that I had cause to question orthodox reality. I guess that if I had seen anything that was untoward before, I'd just dismissed it or put it down to a necessary evil. But this was something that went way, way, way beyond that. And I did get on with the job. They were paying me enough. I can't argue with that. But nonetheless, it didn't rest easy with me. And over the next few years, through various assignments, I remained in the Middle East until '93. And then I went back and took an assignment in Paris, and then I went to live in the US. I was based in Houston, Texas, and traveling throughout North America and Alaska, Canada. But during all this period, obviously my experience in Kuwait never left me. It was never very far from my consciousness. And I started the process, slowly at first, but I started the process of re-educating myself, of questioning everything I thought I knew. Because here was a guy, fast approaching 40, who thought he had a pretty good understanding of the way the world worked, and clearly I didn't. Clearly it was, a construct that I'd been fooled into believing. And eventually, in 1998, I finally took the decision that I did not want to be doing what I'd been doing for the past 20 years, for the next 20 years. And so I really plucked up the courage, if you like, to leave the oil industry. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I knew I didn't want to be doing that. Now, I was in Belize in Central America on that Tuesday morning, and Belize is 1 hour behind Eastern Seaboard time, so it was 8 o'clock in the morning, and I just basically gone down to my favourite bar for breakfast and was watching CNN, and I was watching the events of that morning unfold. And I was watching it in silence, but I regret perhaps my immediate reaction, but it was my gut reaction. I was watching it, and when the second tower fell, I stood up and I said, "This is it. This is the event. This is the event that George Bush has been being groomed for." And I said, "This is going to launch a whole new global agenda." Well, I actually left Belize a few days later. I came back to the UK, and this was the first time I'd lived in the UK for nearly 15 years. And I literally spent the next 7 months full-time researching the events of 9/11. Now, at the time, that was quite difficult. I was obviously totally reliant on information that was in the public domain, although I was able to get some information through some contacts that I had from my time in the US. But it took me until April of 2002 to be absolutely convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that the events of 9/11 did not occur as per the official story of events. Now, even after, we're now 11 years, we've just passed the 11th anniversary of 9/11, and even after 11 years, I would still not say that I know what happened. I think there are many questions that are still hanging out there, and it's not for me to say what happened, because the only people who know what happened are those who effectively executed it. But what I do know is that it had nothing at all to do with 19 Muslims wielding plastic box cutters. And so we build from there. And of course, over the last few years, there's now been hundreds of books written all around the world. More and more people, even though it's 11 years on, more and more people are starting to realize that the events of 9/11 were not as presented by the US government or the mainstream media, and of course did present the US government with the perfect opportunity to launch its hegemonic agenda. And the blueprints for 9/11 are to be found. We look at Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, which he wrote in 1997, or published in 1997, where he talks about the need for an event to kick off the opportunity for the US to establish an aggressive foreign policy. Because Zbigniew Brzezinski was identifying the fact that by the mid-90s, we were in a situation where this was quite a few years now after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and America wasn't taking advantage of the fact that it was the only superpower on the planet. In fact, he coined the term superpower, and he said that this is a narrow window. And if America is going to take advantage of it, it really needs to get off its butt and get out there and establish global hegemony. But he acknowledged that people still remembered Vietnam, and despite the sort of success of the first Gulf War, the American public still didn't really have a stomach for aggressive military campaigns, and it would need something like an event like Pearl Harbor. Well, then a few years later, a right-wing think tank group of neoconservatives led by a guy called John Bolton, who eventually became US ambassador to the United Nations. But this group was called the Project for a New American Century. And they wrote published a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And they published this in September of 2000, so that's 2 months before the US elections, at which George W. Bush was eventually awarded the presidency. And in this document, on page 51, there is effectively it's almost a plagiarized paragraph from Zbigniew Brzezinski's book. But it makes the observation that the American public would not support an aggressive foreign policy agenda except in the event of a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, supposedly on the evening of 9/11, George W. Bush wrote in his diary, "Today we got our new Pearl Harbor." And of course, this is the catalytic event that has effectively kicked off everything that we're dealing with today. As was mentioned last night, the Patriot Act, which is a phenomenal piece of legislation, and it certainly wasn't written post 9/11. They just needed the opportunity to be able to present it to the Senate, and nobody read it. I mean, the Senate, basically the pressure was such that you need to sign that, and if you don't sign it, then you're obviously with the terrorists. And from that point forward, really, certainly in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I mean, all independent thinking was suspended. And this was driven by George Bush's famous statement, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And even to this day, of course, I mean, we see phenomenal growth of internal security, the TSA, Transport Security Agency, the phenomenal powers that are being given to law enforcement agencies in the US. Obama, of course, has effectively signed a decree that he's removed habeas corpus. So basically a US citizen, well, in theory, anybody in the world, but particularly a US citizen, wherever they are in the world, can effectively be lifted and removed, never even being told what it is that they're supposedly guilty of or suspected of. And so we are in a remarkable time here, where we're literally less than 3 months away, less than 90 days away now from the end of a 5,125-year period in our evolutionary process. And if we look through one particular lens, then what we have to look forward to isn't particularly attractive. On the other hand, we can regard this, and should regard it, in my opinion, as an incredible opportunity, because we've all been lulled into this ridiculous sense of well-being, consumerist well-being, and we're turning blind eyes not just to what's happening in the third world, which has been, of course, the case forever, but now what is happening within our own countries. As we see the youth in our own countries effectively being condemned to lives of absolute abject economic slavery. And this is all very well documented, and the blueprint was put out there because the belief system of those who think, in my opinion wrongly, but those who actually believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, they actually believe that they have to tell us, not necessarily on the front pages of the newspapers, although sometimes they do, but they have to put the information, the documentation out into the public domain so that those who do have an interest can find it. But once they told us, once they put it out there, what their plan is, if we don't react, then they take that as a mandate to pursue their agenda. And as I closed my presentation last night, I made the observation, the three most powerful tools that those who are perpetrating this agenda, having their armory, are all in our hands. And the three tools are our willful ignorance, our apathy, and the most powerful tool is our abdication. The most powerful tool for them, that is, not for us. Because our abdication means that by definition, we've got a pretty good idea what's happening. But we choose to completely ignore it. We choose to turn a blind eye, to look the other way, because to acknowledge what is actually glaringly obvious, to acknowledge it might force us out of our comfort zone and force us to maybe actually recognize that there's a bigger picture here rather than our supposedly cozy little world. And all the while, of course, our cozy little world is being eroded. And we have a responsibility here, to not just ourselves and our family, but I think in terms of the future of humanity. And I am an optimist. I mean, I know a lot of what I present takes people through fear and through anger, and these are absolutely critical parts of the process, because you have to go through the fear. You have to go through. I mean, I went through my fear when I was in Kuwait. And like I said, although I was telling the story fairly glibly, 21 years ago, it was a very different matter. And that was my fear. And then there's the anger. I mean, not just the anger at what was happening, but also the anger with the fact that it was evident that so many people were participating in this delusion. And then anger with myself for being so gullible, for literally taking it at face value. I'd like to think that I'm not a complete idiot. But basically, I had been. I'd been totally fooled by this construct. What we have to consider is the very distinct possibility that what's actually happening right now is a tremendous opportunity for humanity, because we are being given the opportunity to step out of our existence, because that's what it is, and start to truly live. But to truly live, we've got to actually participate in the evolutionary process. So consider the possibility. These guys are doing us a massive favour. And this is actually a collective kick up the backside of humanity to say, well, okay, you know, we gave you the easy way, you didn't take it. So this is now, it's time. It's time to absolutely make the choice. And the choice is, do you want to condemn your future generations to lives of abject slavery, or something different? And what that something different is, I don't think we have the definitive of that just yet. I think that, you know, basically that's something that is still unfolding, and that's what makes this time so exciting.